Yes, Josh. And then we get to 2020 by June. So we get there. It goes. Okay, so all right, you're basically continuing the notes from yesterday, though you're not really writing down any notes. It's more just kind of listening and following along a little bit. And then right around 10:35 or so, we'll get a new focus question. So you're not copying a new one just yet. So what I wanted to say yesterday was, towards the end of the period, we started looking at Henry Ford and the cars. We started getting a good sense of people spending a lot of money because of installment buying. So what you're going to see is the 1920s becomes like a very different type of culture than America has been used to. So you don't have to copy this down, but let's just kind of read this and go along with it so we're on the same page. So the 1920s was a time of massive social change. Okay, we've seen this already with the women's right to vote. We're going to see some more stuff today. We saw prohibition, new technologies like cars, entertainment like radios and things along those lines, and installment buying led to new lifestyles and attitudes. Radios began to appear in every house. Athletes, okay, one of the most famous athletes at this time was Babe Ruth. He was a very famous baseball player, if you've never heard of him. Some say he's the best baseball player to ever live. That's him right there. He became a famous person. Aviators, okay. Charles Lindbergh is sometimes known as the most famous American to ever live. At the time, everyone knew who Charles Lindbergh was. He was a pilot. At the time when planes were first coming out, he flew the first transatlantic flight, okay, from one continent to another. Amelia Earhart came a little bit later. She was a very famous pilot who unfortunately passed away, but she was an inspiration to a lot of young women who didn't really ever see themselves as possibly being a pilot or anything along those lines. And entertainers, so these people rose to national and international fame. We're used to being surrounded by, celebrities, whether it's on Twitter or the TV or YouTube. We're used to that. Back in American history, there wasn't like any such thing as a celebrity until 1920. Charles Lindbergh was known as like the first celebrity. Okay, everyone wanted to know what he was doing. Okay, it was like the Kardashians or whoever's popular in your guys' realm of the world. All right. Sorry. All right. Don't have to copy this down, even though it's in red. I just want to show you. The role of women in society underwent extreme changes as well. After women got the right to vote, they're going to have a lot more freedom. And you're going to notice the 1920s, women are going to act and dress a lot differently. Okay. Women prior to 1920 were expected to dress very modestly. They were expected to never show any skin in their outfits. And ultimately, they were expected to kind of be quiet and raise the children. But the 1920s is a lot different. Okay, there started to be these groups of people called flappers. You can see them here, wearing shorter dresses, showing a lot more skin. In previous generation, young women called flappers began to dress in scandalous ways. They started to play sports. They started to be people, even though the temperance movement, it's a little confusing. A lot of women didn't want people to drink, but women would start to drink as well throughout this time. All right, so you're going to kind of see that here. What we're going to do for the last 5-10 minutes of this particular lesson is we're going to watch a scene from the movie called The Great Gatsby. Please, in the chat, if you've ever seen or heard of The Great Gatsby, please let me know in the chat. But we're going to watch a clip from that shortly.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help.
1 second
this
here, guys.
This sentence is grammatically correct.
Okay, so what I want to kind of mention is you're going to watch a scene from a movie. Now, this was a book that I read in 11th grade called The Great Gatsby. It takes place during the 1920s, and it eventually got adapted to a movie. The movie stars a couple of pretty famous people. You'll recognize some of them for sure. Tobey Maguire, for one. He was a Spider-Man at one point. You might recognize him. But we're going to look at a party scene, okay, from The Great Gatsby. And what I want you to notice is how the men and women dress, Okay, are they dressed very nicely? Are they dressed like slobs? Like, notice how they dress. I want you to notice how the people are acting. Okay, and I want you to notice the way the houses and cars look. And I'm going to start to put together everything we learned from lesson 3, installment buying. It's not lesson 3, the lesson on installment buying. So you get a good understanding of what the 1920s were like. Now, Maheen is correct. The movie is a little dramatic. Okay, it's Hollywood. All right, but you're going to kind of get a sense of what a party would look like in the 1920s. Okay, you're going to see how they dress, how they act. You get a good sense of what happens. As you're watching a video, just so you know the plot a little bit, you're going to look at the main character, who's played by Tobey Maguire. I'll show you what that looks like here. That's what he looks like there. Okay, he is not rich. Okay, he's actually poor. He is poor. He is a neighbor of this guy named Gatsby, and he's going to his party next door because he was invited, and he's going to meet Gatsby. Jay Gatsby's his name. And he's just kind of walking over, and he's noticing like how crazy this party is, so to speak. So watch it, enjoy it. It's obviously over dramatic, but it gives you a good sense of what the 1920s were kind of like.
You see, the rest of New York simply came, uninvited. The whole city packed into automobiles, and all weekend, every weekend, ended up at Gatsby's. And I mean everyone, from every walk of life, from every corner of New York City. This kaleidoscopic carnival spilled through Gatsby's door.
My invitation. Oh, just my throat. You don't need to know the guy. Certainly not my invitation.
Caravansary of billionaire Playboy publishers and their blonde nurses. Heiresses comparing inheritances on Gatsby's beach. My boss, Walter Chase, losing money at the roulette tables. Gossip columnists alongside gangsters and governors exchanging telephone numbers. Film stars, Broadway directors, morality protectors, high school defectors, and Ewing Klipspringer, dubious descendant of Beethoven.
You know where I might find the host, Mr. Gatsby? I live just next door.
Gatsby? I've never seen Mr. Gatsby, sir. Why, no one has.
Alone and a little embarrassed, I decided to get roaring drunk.
Oh, you penniless panty waste. I'm stealing her away, Caraway. Come on. A jazz history of the world and accompanying fireworks!
Come on, Nick.
Look around you. Rich girls don't marry poor boys. Ugh, she's mine.
Your face is familiar. Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war?
Oh, yes, the 9th Battalion.
I was in the 7th.
Excuse me.
I knew you looked familiar. Having a good time, old
Oh,
sport?
the whole thing's incredible. I live just next door. He sent me an actual invitation. Seems I'm the only one. I still haven't met Mr. Gatsby.
No one's met him. They say he's 3rd cousin to the Kaiser and 2nd cousin to the devil.
I'm afraid I haven't been a very good host, old sport. You see, I'm Gatsby.
His smile was one of those rare smiles that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life.
Okay, you might recognize that famous meme right there. That's a pretty famous one, but it's from this movie. So yeah, a couple things. So, you know, Jay Gatsby himself, played by Leo DiCaprio, is rich, make no mistake about it. But the people there, okay, if you listen, like rich girls don't marry poor boys. He's poor. A lot of the people there are poor. And they're all kind of mixing together, wearing these fancy clothes, fancy outfits. You saw the fancy cars. People are living their best life, so to speak, because of installment buying. And this became the culture. So when it becomes a part of the culture, like when it's the culture for everyone to own a fancy cell phone, people start spending money on things they can't really afford. Okay, and this is one of those things where people are buying cars they can't afford. They're buying suits they can't afford. They're buying, houses they can't afford. All right, this is the problem with the Roaring '20s is people are spending outside of their means. And what I kind of like to say about this is, and I give this example a lot, the Roaring '20s is like one big party, and I kind of envision the Great Gatsby. You know, people for 8-9 years are really just enjoying themselves and, you know, not really thinking about the future, so to speak. And then, you know, you guys know the side effects of alcohol is, you know, a hangover. All right. The Great Depression in the 1930s is the hangover that comes after the party. All right. People spent too much. They got themselves in too much debt. And when it came time to pay back all of this money, they couldn't afford it. And the country literally fell apart. How would one avoid falling into the effects of the Great Depression? Well, personally, you don't want to spend outside of your means. Okay, if you know you're a teacher like I am, you know we make good enough money, but I shouldn't be buying a $3 million home. I can't afford that. All right, I shouldn't be buying I have the freedom to. That's one of the things you'll learn about our country is you have the freedom to buy what you want. You know, I shouldn't be buying the most expensive car. I shouldn't be buying a Rolls Royce. All right, I'm living outside of my means when I do that, and you fall into debt. So personally, you want to make sure that you are not, spending too much money. Correct. It wasn't a one-time party. They did this for a whole decade. Okay, people are constantly living outside of their means, and it becomes a huge, huge problem. So when you look at the cars, when you look at installment buying, when you see how this lifestyle was, you could see how, you know, people got a little too carried away, and it kind of bit everyone in the butt, honestly. Louise, that's a good question. If you installment buy, it's fine, but you want to installment buy things you can afford. Okay, so a great example is like the banks now. This is one way we avoid another Great Depression. If I go to the bank and be like, look, I want to buy this $5 million home, they're going to be like, you're a teacher, you can't afford that, we're not going to give you a loan. But back in history, back in the 1920s, the banks just gave out loans to everyone. They just trusted everyone. Emanuela, it's a good question. They honestly did not realize that this could be the effect of people overspending. I think some financial people understood it, but in terms of the government, they didn't really understand what could happen with all this installment buying. Also, governors were at these parties and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so they were enjoying their life too. And ultimately, they didn't see towards the end because they couldn't predict the future. All right, a big thing why we look back in history is so we don't make the same mistakes. So we know now not to do something like that. But at the time, no one really understood that. Okay? So hopefully you guys, learned some things and built upon your learning from sixth grade, where the stock, with the stock market crash, it's a lot more than that. Yeah, well, yeah, the YOLO. Absolutely, Liz Mel. If you noticed a lot of the members playing in the band, which we'll learn about actually going to lead into this lesson, playing some jazz music, they would definitely be there. Now, a lot of the parties were segregated not because of Jim Crow. They were just, that's who you associated with. It wasn't really a culture. America wasn't really a place in the 1920s where different groups of people were mixing together. Italians stay with the Italians, Irish stay with the Irish, blacks stay with blacks, Hispanics stay with Hispanics. That's just how it was. It took until like the 1940s, 50s, 60s for that to change. All right. All right. Let's go back to here. So now we have a new focus question. All right. Which is, how did African Americans have a rebirth of culture throughout the 1920s? All right. So I'll give you a minute to copy this down. Understand, every lesson so far in the Roaring Twenties has been one day on one topic, and then we switch. All right, so we started with Prohibition, then we went randomly to the women's rights movement, then we went randomly to installment buying, and now we're going to the African Americans. Remember, the only two consistent things in this unit are not the topics. It is all centered around change in our country, and it's all centered around it being in the 1920s. Okay, those are the only two consistent things. All right. What you're about to learn now has nothing to do with the women's rights movement, has nothing to do with installment buying. Okay, it's just a different topic. All right, so you need to make sure we understand the focus question by the end of the period. All right. So how did African Americans have a rebirth of culture throughout the 1920s? So you have to copy down two slides. The first of which, they're both pretty big on the region, so we want to make sure we take our time and really understand what's going on. All right, so let's first learn about the Great Migration, which was a term that started in 1914, but gained its popularity in the 1920s. So it was at its height, it was the biggest throughout the 1920s. So where do we last leave off with African Americans? Well, we should still know Jim Crow laws are still a thing. Plessy versus Ferguson has made segregation legal in the entire country. We should know from the Progressive Era, Ida B. Wells and George Washington Carver, W.E.B. Du Bois, these people are trying to advance African American equality, but not too much was done. Yes, copy down the blue part. Not too much was done. All right. So since not too much was done, a lot of African Americans were still living in the former Confederacy, were still living in the South. And what's going to happen is a lot of African Americans are just going to be, one, kind of sick and tired of living in the South because of the segregation and the racism in the area. And also, something's going to happen. Who remembers what happens in 1914? I was on parental leave, but you should know what big world event happens in 1914. What big world event happens in World War I is correct. Correct. So World War I takes place in 1914, and eventually by 1917, America's gotten involved. A lot of white people, white males, went and fought in the war. We know from the Selective Service Act. You should remember the Harlem Hellfighters. There were some black people too, but it was mostly white people that ended up going into World War I. So what happened was a lot of jobs became available. So also because a lot of jobs became available, a lot of black people started to say, okay, we need to move. And the Great Migration is a term where the African Americans in the South started to move north out of the South and moved west. Okay, so that's what the Great Migration refers to. All right. Most of the time when these African Americans left, they were farmers, but there's not many farms up north. There's some out west, but not up north. So what they decided to do was they decided to not only move, but they decided to change their job. Okay, they started to work in factories. In fact, just piggybacking off yesterday's lesson, one of the biggest factories they worked in was in Illinois, in Detroit. All right, Detroit, Michigan, where Henry Ford had his motor company. All right, so a lot of African Americans worked at Ford's motor plant, And you're going to learn that Ford was awesome because he paid white and black workers the same, all right, which was something not a lot of people did at the time. All right, that was a pretty cool thing, though. All right. So they moved to New York City. All right, they moved to Philadelphia. They moved to Chicago, and they also moved out west. Now, the biggest reason why a lot of them left, besides the jobs, okay, because a lot of people just move to jobs. Whenever people migrate, that's usually a huge reason. If you have ever moved in your life, okay, from one state to another or one city to another, it sometimes is related to your parents getting a new job. All right, so migration because of a job is a big thing. But it's also because, you know, we are 60 years, 70 years after the Civil War, but the Jim Crow laws are still going on. There's still a lot of segregation. There's still racism. And the South is probably the most racist and segregated area. So a lot of African Americans wanted to get away from that. Okay, I can't blame them. So they start moving up north and they start moving out west for better jobs and obviously to escape the racism. Now I want to make clear, Plessy versus Ferguson, which said separate but equal is okay, was a federal thing. So there was segregation in the north and the west as well, but it wasn't as bad. All right, and since the segregation wasn't as bad, since the racism wasn't as bad, many African Americans wanted to move up to these areas. Now, very quickly, does anyone know the big area of New York City where the African Americans moved to? So like what borough or what area did African Americans move to? Correct, Harlem is correct. All right, now remember there's segregation and basically, you know, your groups of people stayed with your groups of people. So the Bronx used to be very Italian, all right, back during this time. So if you came to the Bronx, there's a good chance you were going to be living amongst a lot of Italian people. Brooklyn used to be very Jewish, okay, very Jewish area. The area that was primarily black was Harlem, all right, because this is where the segregation kind of separated different groups of people. The cool thing about Harlem, though, is Harlem became a pretty famous place pretty quickly. All right, so the Great Migration, many people decided to move up to Harlem in New York City, along with some other places. Let's do this regions question quick. What was a primary reason for the Great Migration of African Americans to northern cities during World War I? Okay, let's see, you guys put number one. One is correct. A lot of job opportunities available, ladies and gentlemen. So many African Americans moved up there and started working in those factories. This is also related, see how it all comes together? This is also related to industrialization. All right, more industry, more jobs. It wasn't just immigrants filling these jobs, it was also African Americans too. Last slide for today is something known as the Harlem Renaissance. All right, so let's first break down the word Renaissance. When you guys get to 10th grade, there is a time period in the 1500s in Europe when you get to world history called the Renaissance. And Renaissance is another word for rebirth. Okay, it's when you're trying to, trying to get back to what you used to do or trying to get back to a way of life you used to have. So like if you were someone who in 7th grade was a great student doing extremely well, you're getting all 90s and 100s. Right? And then in 8th grade, you kind of falter a little bit, but then you say, you know what? I want to change it a little bit. I want to be have a renaissance. That means you're having a rebirth. You're trying to get back to what you were doing years ago. All right? Now, when you get to world history, you'll learn that the Renaissance period was a period where a lot of the people in Europe, like specifically Italy, they were trying to have a rebirth of their religion and a rebirth of their culture back from like the glory days of ancient Rome. All right, so it's kind of like going back to that. Now, the Harlem Renaissance takes that name and takes that same idea. Many African Americans, obviously, because their ancestors, their parents, their grandparents were slaves at the time, though people who were most likely living throughout the 1920s weren't slaves themselves, their parents or grandparents were. So many of them never really had a culture. Okay, if you're a slave, your culture, you don't have a culture, you don't have freedom, you don't have those choice to live your life in a certain way. So the Harlem Renaissance is a time to kind of reestablish what it means for Black culture. All right. And the reason it's called the Harlem Renaissance was it really started in Harlem, New York, and was most popular in Harlem, New York. All right. It started around 1919, ended around the early 1940s, 1950s, but it was at its height in the 1920s. So this is why we learn about it now. Most of the major figures of the Harlem Renaissance, as we've mentioned, had parents or grandparents that have grown up during slavery. Obviously, the people living throughout this time in Harlem are dealing with segregation and enhanced racism, which is, obviously an unfortunate thing. So what they're going to do is they want to establish African-American culture through art. All right. So when I mean art, I mean there's a lot of different ways under the realm of art. You obviously have, pictures and photographs. You have books, you have poems, you have newspapers, and music. Okay, there's many different ways to express your art, and a lot of African Americans in Harlem established some different ways to kind of go about it. Many famous Harlem Renaissance people, as you're going to learn some of them, they often made pictures, paintings, their writings, their poetry was often very often showed the struggle for African Americans, but there was always this little touch of hope. There's a very famous, if you guys want to look up on your own time right now, if you type in Langston Hughes, okay, and then look at some of his poems. One of his most famous poems is I Too. Okay, so if you want to, on your own time, kind of look at that. It's called I Too Sing America, and he kind of talks about how, he's, an African American, he's kind of mistreated, he's overlooked, he's not really, very well known or really cared about. But one of the famous things towards the end is basically towards the end, he's hopeful that that's all changing now. All right, and then they'll see how beautiful we are, and they'll see that I too am an American. It's a very nice poem. If you have some time, you want to look at it. But a lot of their culture was, showing that struggle of going through slavery, was showing, who they were, but then also celebrating, that, they're now a lot more free. They're able to express their ideas, and you kind of see this here throughout the Harlem Renaissance. All right. Does anyone know the very famous music that the African Americans created throughout the 1920s? Okay, very good. Jazz. Now, I'm not sure if you have time, if you want to ask Miss Pate. I'm not a musical lyricist. I don't really understand music theory, but a lot of music experts will say that jazz music would eventually lead to modern day hip hop and rap. Without jazz, you would never have hip hop and rap, which I find kind of cool because they don't sound very similar, jazz music, but they are kind of similar. Okay, in terms of the free flowing music and a lot of the way that the music goes. But I'm not an expert on music, so I don't want to care or say I can really explain it. But please ask Ms. Pate or look up or research to see how those two react. Let's try this before we get to the assignment. A major effect of the Harlem Renaissance was that it what? All right. If you can remember the Harlem Renaissance has something to do with African American culture, you're going to get the question every time. All right, it should be pretty straightforward. All right. So here's what we're going to do. So eventually, I just want to tell you something. While you guys are working on the assignment, I'm going to actually play some jazz music so you guys can get a good sense of what jazz music sounds like by a very famous jazz musician. His name was Louis Armstrong. So I want you guys kind of to hear his music. If you really don't like the music, you can just mute the mic and, you don't have to. But I think it'd be a good thing to kind of listen to so you kind of get a sense of what the music kind of sounded like. And I'll be honest, I kind of like the music. I don't like listening to jazz in my free time, but if you put it on, I'm definitely not going to turn it off, sort of thing. All right. And these here are some of the most famous African-American Harlem Renaissance writers, poets, musicians, throughout this time. Langston Hughes, we've already mentioned. Louis Armstrong's very popular. Billie Holiday's very popular. There was a movie that just came out on Billie Holiday if you guys want to watch it. I haven't seen it yet. I heard it's pretty good, though. And then there's some other people. So while you're going through the reading, you're going to see these names. So I want you to have a face to, who they were, sort of thing. All right. But before we do that, let's go to the assignment for today. All right. If you're looking at the Harlem Renaissance, you should notice you have a Billie Holiday was more of a singer, but I believe she was also maybe doing a little bit of acting, but she is a singer. Okay. And quite a good one, I would say. But again, I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. All right, so we have 2 pages of reading on the Harlem Renaissance. Guys, the secret is it's really written in like a 6th, 7th grade way. But I think it's good just to kind of get a name and kind of see what these people did and how they influenced African-American culture throughout this time. And yeah, so you have 2 pages of reading. Then you have 12 word bank matching type of things. Okay, so you're going to see Paul Robeson. You're going to see, Gene Toomer. Okay, and then you guys can do the reading. Everything is going to be from the reading. Then along with some multiple choice. As per usual, you will not be able to write on this assignment. Okay, so you need to do it on the separate Google Doc that I shared. I think you guys are pretty used to that at this point in time. All right. Now, before, no one should go anywhere. I just have a couple things to say before the end of the period, before you guys head into the weekend. I am going to play this video so you can hear the music. If you don't care to listen, you can just mute it. We will come back together at 11:05 to wrap things up. All right? Let me know if you have any questions.
Sing one song of my old Kentucky home. In summer, the folks, they all gay. By and by, hard times will knock at the door. My old Kentucky home far away. Yes, we've no more, my lady. Baba do 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 we number today. We will sing one song for my old Kentucky home, my old Kentucky home, far away. Take it, bass, face. Everybody sing together. We number my lady. Oh yeah, we number today. We will sing one song for my old Kentucky home, my old Kentucky home, far away. Take it
All right. Well, by that song, I guess we can start to wrap it up there before a new song starts. But yeah, you guys got the YouTube. You can go listen to any jazz music you want. So the thing I wanted to say is I want to just give you a quick heads up. Next Friday, you will have your Unit 5 test. You'll start getting more information on that next week. But you're going to learn and notice you're not going to like this. The final marking period, I don't give you review sheets and I don't tell you what's on tests. This is to help prepare us for the Regents. You will get a quizzes, so that kind of helps. But like, I don't tell you what's on the test anymore. That stuff is long gone, and it's going to be tough. All right. I think I mentioned this back in the beginning of the year, but I'm coming with that blindsided notion now. So just kind of keep that in mind. That honestly. You will not be getting a review sheet. All right. But you will kind of get a good sense and make you happy with me to tell us you have a test. That was unintentional, but it does seem kind of cruel when I think about it. But yeah. So I wanted to give you that information. We'll talk more about the test and how it will go. Listen, it may be a little harder to study and prepare, but like you'll know what's on it. Like you guys see how the lessons go. You guys have a good sense now of how these tests go. You guys should be fine. Monday's lesson, I think you will really, really like. It's going to be on capitalism and communism. We're going to start having some very tough and adult conversations that, you guys need to bring your A game for. Because learning about communism and learning about capitalism and the comparison of the two is not easy to teach. All right, so we want to make sure that we're ready to go on Monday. All right. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. I'm sorry about the bad news, but I'd rather tell you now than tell you the day before the test. Have a good rest of your day. All right. Bye-bye, guys.